So I'm here because scientists are not being listened to. For my sons. And we've been trying to warn you guys for so many decades that we're heading towards a fucking catastrophe. And we've been being ignored. The scientists of the world have been being ignored. And it's gotta stop. We're gonna lose everything. And we're not joking. We're not lying. We're not exaggerating. This is so bad, everyone. This is so much bigger than any of us. It's time for all of us to stand up. We have to stop this fossil fuel industry. We have to stop the financing of fossil fuels. We have to stop new fossil fuel projects. We don't have any carbon budget left. The more carbon we put into the atmosphere now, the worse everything is gonna get. It's already really, really bad. We're seeing heat domes, we're seeing people drowning, we're seeing famine starting to pop up, we're seeing wildfires getting worse. It's gonna literally take us to the brink of civilizational collapse, and we have to stop it right now.
I don't know what this is. Although forest fires in summer are normal here, their ferocity this year is being blamed on unusually high temperatures. Along with smoke, they've also been spewing out record amounts of greenhouse gases. Scientists fear that this will further accelerate climate change in one of Earth's greenhouse gases. Scientists fear that this will further accelerate climate change in one of Earth's
Hi, my name is Jerry Kroth. I'm a professor in California, and I wrote a book just 2 years ago, okay? Just 2 years ago, and I thought it was very radical. It's called Ecocide, Why Radical Interventions Are Needed Now to Stop Climate Apocalypse. And I made a video 2 years ago on that subject. And everything has changed in just 2 years, which is why I'm making this video, okay? Just astonishing things have happened. So this is an update, and let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it does not look good. All right, so this, if you were an alien and you looked at planet Earth and took thermal measurements, this is what it would look like in 1900, okay? And as we approach World War II, it's starting to show signs of heating up. By the time we get to the millennium, we are starting to really see global warming. And as we get into 2015, we say, oh my God, and this is 2020. Okay, now, can you imagine what that looks like 10 years from now? So I would like to start this update by trying to figure out why Greta's crying.
If you are able to live in this society without feeling bad, without becoming depressed or something, then if you feel bad today, so many people are so sad and so depressed, but that's a good thing, because that means they still have empathy.
So we're going to begin this by looking at the little lines going down on your lower left. Red line is a fluctuation of CO2 in parts per million, and the blue line is the annual average. So if you look at the Kyoto Accords in 1992, they happened at about 350 parts per million in CO2. And then all the nations of the world, except George Bush, said, we're on board, we're going to do whatever we can. So that CO2 just keeps going up. So at around 375 parts per million, an organization was started called 350.org. Lots of publicity, well-known environmentalists involving, endorsing, subscribing, activism, bestsellers. And they said we need to get this down to 350 from 375. That was their hope. But CO2 keeps going up and up and up. So we get to not 2016, we're at about 400 parts per million. And the Paris Accords are signed, where all the nations of the world, except Trump, say we are really going to do something now. We are going to cut emissions. But CO2 keeps going up. Greta comes on the scene about maybe 412 parts per million. And she starts a mass movement. Really, lots and lots of people are energized by what she's saying. And still, CO2 keeps going up and up, more than it's ever been in 5,000 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 100,000 years. Okay. So if you look at this graph in 2013, it shows you the parts per million were about 398. Okay. And that was larger, or a greater amount of CO2 in the atmosphere than in 800,000 years. Okay. But here's one of the reasons I'm making this video. On April 7th of this year, it hit 421 parts per million, okay? Which makes it bigger, larger, more than in 3.6 million years, not 800,000. Okay? That is how out of control we are. All right? So maybe that's why Greta is crying, because it's not stopping. So let's talk about a few things. Like the Paris Accords were all about stopping it before the planet warms to 1.5 degrees. Well, when will we hit 1.5 degrees? Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, that's the organization. If you look at their bibliography, there are 6,000 articles in their bibliography, multiple authors, probably 10,000 scientists were consulted. Okay? So their recommendations are really a compilation of 10,000 scientists' points of view. They say we are going to hit 1.5 degrees of warming. We're at about 1.2 now. When we hit 430 parts per million. Okay? Well, when are we going to hit 2 degrees of warming? Well, that'll be when we hit 450 parts per million in CO2. How about 3 degrees? Well, that happens when we hit 500 parts per million. All right? So, let's review what happens at 1.5 degrees. Well, extreme hot days will get 3 degrees hotter than they are. That's Death Valley. You can add 3 degrees to that number of centigrade, 59 plus 3. 1 million more square miles of permafrost will melt. Hurricanes will become more intense than they already are. 270 million more people will be short of water. Coral reefs will decline 70%, and there will be more droughts and wildfires. Okay, well then what happens at 2 degrees of warming? Coral reefs become non-existent. Global and regional food insecurities, agriculture is impacted. Some of the areas of the world will become uninhabitable. 16% of plants and 18% of insects will disappear. 37% of the entire human population will be exposed to extreme heat. There will be a rapid evacuation of the tropics. Well, let's review what the tropics are. That was the tropics. So you can imagine a huge migration of people out of that area. You can already see it's happening in Africa, and you can see it at the borders of the United States. Say goodbye to your Caribbean vacation, I guess. But the most important thing that happens at 2 degrees is this, quotation, the first major tipping point, Arctic permafrost melt, will begin. 2 degrees centigrade of warming could activate a domino-like cascade that would be irreversible. Now, what do you mean by that? This is the Earth, and that's when we have a ice cap. The albedo of the Earth reflects some back into space. As the ice cap melts, the Arctic Ocean becomes blue and it absorbs more heat. The Arctic is actually warming 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth. That red line is declining sea ice in square kilometers, okay, since 1978. So as that melts, permafrost in northern Canada and Siberia melts, and twice as much carbon is embedded in the permafrost as in the atmosphere. If that's released with methane, then it'll double the amount of CO2 that we have in the atmosphere. So what you see there is a loss of about half, a little more than half, of the Arctic ice up until now. But at 2 degrees of warming, that will set off that chain reaction. Here is a Russian movie poking a hole in the permafrost and igniting escaping methane. Be careful, he says. Okay, that's methane being ignited. All right, so how does that work? The ice cap shrinks, therefore the Arctic warms. The Arctic warms, permafrost melts. Permafrost melts, CO2 and methane are released. And that causes more warming. And that causes more ice shrinkage. And that causes more permafrost melting. And that causes more CO2. And that causes more warming. And it is a vicious circle that becomes autonomous, irreversible. That's what they mean by a tipping point. That happens when we get to 450 parts per million. All right. Well, then what happens at 3 degrees of warming? Well, that's the collapse of the Amazon right there. Billions of climate refugees. And most importantly, 1 in 8 species will be facing extinction if we hit 3 degrees of warming. That is a critical number. So here comes the shock. And I told you this is going to be a toughie, so I hope you're ready for it. The Paris Accords were signed in 2016, saying we hope we're going to try our very best not to reach 430 parts per million and thus prevent 1.5 degrees of warming before 2030. That was the intent. And unfortunately, the reality is far different, which is what I'm going to present to you here. I'm a psychologist. I am not a climate scientist. I'm interested in collective insanity. I'm interested in people who are suffering from delusions, false beliefs, who are victims of propaganda, who generate propaganda, who are in denial, who are pretending. All of those things are related to the climate issue. But I am not a climate scientist. So my PhD is in psychology. So I have to check my numbers with climate scientists whenever I'm talking about parts per million. So I want you to know that I have been in touch with climate scientists and said, is this right? Is this right? Is this correct? Okay, this has been vetted. So let's take a look now at this data. We know that we hit 400 parts per billion in 2015. One scientist said you can't look at 421. You have to look at the annual average. Those are the numbers that were important. So the annual average was not 421 in 2020, it was 416. Okay? That was the annual average for the parts per billion. And 1.5 degrees happens at 430 parts per million. Good. When is this going to happen? We're going to do this again, slowly. Watch very carefully. There's 400 parts per million in 2015. There's 416 parts per million in 2020. That means it is increasing 3.2 parts per million per year. Regardless of what we're doing or attempting to do, it's increasing at that level. So let's do the math. In 2021, it's going to reach 419 parts per million. In 2022, it's going to reach 422 parts per million. In 2023, it's going to reach 425 parts per million. In 2024, 428 parts per million. And in 2025, 432. We will hit 430 parts per million right here. And ladies and gentlemen, that is 3 years from now. That is way earlier than we thought, much earlier than we anticipated. Which means if we hit 430 parts per million, we will hit 1.5 degrees, and there is almost nothing we can do to stop it after that. So let's finish our calculations. When are we going to get to 2 degrees of warming? When are we going to get to 3 degrees? Well, let's take a look. Here's what we established so far. The IPCC says we'll cross the threshold for 1.5 degrees at 4:30. That's late 2024, right? The IPCC says we'll cross the threshold for 2 degrees of warming at 450 parts per million, and that is 2030. That's way earlier than we thought. Way earlier than we thought. And the IPCC says we'll cross the threshold for 3 degrees, and you can say Armageddon there. We will cross that threshold at 500 parts per million. A number of scientists and asked a question, are these numbers correct? This guy has a wonderful show on YouTube, Dave Borlis, and he wrote back and said, here's an article you'll find supportive. Global warming will happen faster than you think. So he sent me this graph, and the IPCC said that we will hit 1.5 degrees in 2040 originally. This article, refereed, peer-reviewed, said we will hit 1.5 degrees in 2030, and what I just told you is that we will hit 430 parts per million, which will eventually lead to 1.5 degrees in 2024. So do I sound hysterical? Warming is increasing beyond our wildest, most radical forecasts. So I want to check myself, and I ask another scientist, and here's what he said. If we keep on increasing our emissions, then yes, the budget for 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade will be exhausted very quickly. So adding 3.2 parts per billion per year is likely as bad as you assume. That's why reducing emissions is so urgent. The IPCC will release new modeling next year. Well, they are going to release a new report this November, okay? And nobody knows exactly what's in it. Some people have leaked information from it. They say it's very scary. They're revising their forecasts. We don't have as much time as we think. So I'd like to make an appeal at this time to you, okay? Because I have very intelligent subscribers, and they're concerned about climate, and they're concerned, that's why they're watching this. But some people drop out at 15 or 20 minutes, and they say, I've got too much data, or too many calculations, or it's too negative, or I got the idea, and so I'm going on my way. I'd like to make an appeal to you. Okay? This is your life. This is your children's future. This is about humanity's future. This is the biggest story of the 21st century. This is totally scary. We need to be on firm grounds factually before we go into the conclusions of this talk. So I hope you'll stick it out. It appears that we just lost 20 years of time that we thought we had. Okay? We only have 8.5 years to solve this problem. More explanation, please. Okay, I'd like to talk to you about temperature. CO2 to 430 parts per million, we're going to hit 1.5 degrees, but there could be a lag. There could be a lag of a few years, and we need to talk about that, all right? So, in summary, when we will hit 430 parts per million at our present rate in 2024, but we won't hit 1.5 degrees of warming until about 2031. There's a lag of 6 years between CO2 and temperature. We hit 450 parts per million in 2030, but there's a lag of maybe 8 years before we hit 2 degrees of warming. Okay. So do we have until 2038? Do we have 17 years to figure this out, or just 8.5 years to figure this out? I think the answer is 8.5 years. Okay. And here's the reason. Please read this quote. Even if carbon emissions stop completely right now, as the oceans catch up with the atmosphere, the Earth's temperature would rise about another 0.6 of a degree of centigrade more. Okay, that's called committed warming. So we don't have 17 years. The IPC says we will be on our way to 1.5 degrees when we hit 430. And when is that? It's not 2030, as we were told. It's 2024. Okay, the IPC said we will be on our way to 2 degrees of warming when we hit 450. And when is that? It's not 2050, as many people think even now. It will hit 450 in 2030. So let's just get a sense of how far from reality we are. This is a video that was made last year, and it's wrong.
Emissions. We need to do more than that. To have a hope of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050.
Okay, she says we need to cut emissions by half to keep under 1.5 degrees by 2030. That's wrong. Sorry, chances are we will hit 430 parts per million in 3 years and then be racing headlong towards 1.5 degrees. She says get to net zero in 2050. Net zero emissions. Sorry, but chances are that we will hit 450 parts per million in 8.5 years. And then we will hit 2 degrees by 2038. You're off by many, many, many years, more than a decade. The European Union just passed a law. This is what, June, a couple weeks ago, saying all 27 countries must cut emissions 55% by 2030 and be at net zero by 2050. Isn't that nice? Cut emissions to zero by 2050 to stay under 2 degrees. Wonderful, admirable. But we will hit 450 parts per million in 8.5 years. And to avoid that, we need to be at net zero by 2030, not by 2050. So, is there debate? Is there a point? When is there a point of no return? Well, some people, if you look at the literature, it's all over the place. Some say we'll hit 2 degrees in 2060. Some say it's 2040. Some say it's 2035. Some say we already passed it, the point of no return. Let's start with the radicals. Guy McPherson, professor from Arizona, says we've already passed the point of no return. So on his website, there's a little panel that says, are you considering suicide? Call this number. Another professor in the Netherlands believes we've already passed the point of no return. So let's be a little more hopeful. Professor in the Netherlands says the point of no return is 2035. Article in the Yale Environmental Review says it's 2035. When they say point of no return, I think they mean that the tipping points will be breached, or at least the first one. Another professor from Oxford, 2035. The United Nations said that 2030 was the point where things become irreversible. So that clearly means we do not have until 2050. We don't have until 2040. We don't even have until 2035. We will hit 450 parts per million in 2030, and we have to stop it before it reaches that level. If not, we cascade into the first point of no return via committed warming. Okay, doesn't that all mean we have to be at net zero by 2030? Good question. I wrote for confirmation to another scientist to say, am I still on the right track here? Here's what he said. 2030 is indeed the date that is generally agreed now by the most major climate organizations, including the UN and the IPCC, as a sort of cutoff point. It is the date by which we will use up the existing global carbon budget of about 400 gigatons, based on our current consumption levels. So I do not think your calculations are in any way exaggerating the urgency of this predicament. Okay, maybe that's why she's crying. So let's talk about tipping points for.
So I made this climate model, an extremely basic climate model. Normally we think of climate change kind of like this. Add a bit of CO2, get a bit of heat. And that's true until a certain point, when a slight nudge can lead to drastic changes. This is the idea of a tipping point. Some of Earth's systems are teetering on the edge of major changes because of a heating planet. And if we nudge them past a certain point, they could change dramatically, regardless of what we do afterward.
So here's a Swedish scientist who's basically confirming everything that we have talked about up to this point.
We have now had 10 years of record-breaking climate extremes. Fires blaze in Australia, Siberia, California, and the Amazon. Floods in China, Bangladesh, and India. We're now enduring heat waves across the entire northern hemisphere. We risk crossing tipping points that shift the planet from being our best resilient friend, dampening our impacts, to start working against us, amplifying the heat. When my scientific colleagues summarized, about a decade ago, for the first time, the state of knowledge on climate tipping points, just one place had strong evidence that it was on a serious downward spiral: Arctic sea ice. Other tipping points were a long way off, 50 or 100 turns around the sun. Just last year, we revisited these systems, and I got the shock of my career. In Siberia, permafrost is now thawing at dramatic scales. Greenland is losing trillions of tons of ice and may be approaching a tipping point. The great forests of the north are burning with plumes of smoke the size of Europe. The Atlantic Ocean circulation is slowing. The Amazon rainforest is weakening and may start emitting carbon within 15 years. Half of the coral of the Great Barrier Reef has died. West Antarctica may have crossed the tipping point already today. And now, the most solid of glaciers on Earth, East Antarctica, parts of it are becoming unstable. 9 out of the 15 big biophysical systems that regulate climate are now on the move, showing worrying signs of decline and potentially approaching tipping points. The next 10 years, to 2030, must see the most profound transformation the world has ever known.
The Green New Deal, which was done a couple of years ago, was considered so radical, so impractical. It said we have to get to net zero by 2030. It's actually correct. It may be radical, but it's true. So how far from reality are we? Here's Dianne Feinstein scolding children who want to support the Green New Deal.
We're standing up, we're asking for the new Green Deal.
And we're trying to present this letter that we've made to Senator Feinstein.
We
are trying to ask you to vote yes on the Green New Deal.
Please.
Okay, I'll tell you what. We have our own Green New Deal piece of legislation.
Well, we're trying
to
promote the Green New Deal.
Well, there are reasons why I can't, because there's no way to pay for it.
Yes, there is.
That's
we
the
have
big
tons of
reason.
money going to the military. A lot of ours is going to the military.
But we have come to a point where our Earth is dying, literally, and it is going to be a pricey and ambitious plan that is needed to deal with the magnitude of that issue. And so we're here asking you to vote yes on the resolution for the Green New Deal, because that is the only
That resolution will not pass the Senate, and you can take that back to whoever sent you here.
Some scientists said that we have 12 years to turn this around.
Well, it's not going to get turned around in 10 years.
So the Green New Deal proposed cutting emissions 100% by 2030. Dianne's Green New Deal proposed cutting emissions 30% by 2030. Good luck, Dianne. So, tipping point, not 2045, not 2035, not 2034. It will hit 450 if we continue this way in 2030, and there's no stopping 2 degrees of warming after that. In other words, we have 8.5 years to stop it, and that's why I'm making this video and revising everything I've said up to now because this is a genuine, bona fide planetary emergency. Okay. More about the dreamland that we're living in. Okay. But, you say, what about all those inventions? What about optimism? What about hope? What about all those mitigation strategies? What about the innovations we keep reading about? What about those? Well, let's take a look at some exciting innovations. Amazon is planning to build a solar farm in Mississippi. Ha-ha! That's just this 4 weeks ago they announced that. She owes her big environmental prize to teaching goats how to eat plastic. Good for her. Give that lady a medal. Brussels is planning to ban conventional cars by 2035. Wonderful. New Mexico's largest solar project is underway. Denmark is mapping the seas to make a wind farm. New Zealand is committing to being carbon neutral by 2050. A loophole, but gosh, we have to congratulate New Zealand, don't we? Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are going to build a nuclear power plant and show that it demonstrate that it could help us. China is pledging to become carbon neutral by 2060. Oh gosh, China, how grateful we are. And there's Tim Cook standing on the world's most sustainable office building, Apple Computer. I wonder what Greta has to say about all this.
End of my talk. And this is where people usually start talking about hope. Solar panels, wind power, circular economy, and so on. But I'm not going to do that. We've had 30 years of pep talking and selling positive ideas. And I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. Because if it would have, the emissions would have gone down by now. They haven't. Today, we use 100 million barrels of oil every single day. There are no politics to change that. There are no rules to keep that oil in the ground. So we can't save the world by playing by the rules. Because the rules have to be changed. Everything needs to change. And it has to start today. Thank you.
So you are kind of a sane person in an insane world. If you're watching this video, you care about global warming. You have probably changed your diet. You probably conserve, you recycle. Maybe you're a member of a few activist organizations or you contribute to them. Maybe you bought yourself an electric vehicle or an EV or a hybrid. You've tried to lower your carbon footprint. But you live in an insane world. And John Lennon said, our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends. And I think I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that. That was long before global warming was on our consciousness. But that's a pretty true statement about what we're going to look at right now. Because if you look at CO2, that graph, you say, wait a minute, where is everything that I have done? I have done so much. Our organizations have done so much. Where are the effects of what we've done? All of our demonstration projects. Do you see any dips, any declines at all in CO2 up through 2021? I'm sorry, it is a big fat zero. And the human race needs to face reality. More signs of insanity. What about all those hopeful strategies that we heard about? Well, there's methane, okay? Do you see any declines in methane? It is many times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. Do you see it going down 10%, 20%, 50%? It's not going down at all. It's one big fat zero. And the human race needs to face reality. It is living in the dreamland. This is fossil fuels. Look at that. That's the first graph that's going down. We went from 100 million barrels of oil down to 85 million. Wonderful. Look at that progress. What's the cause of that? COVID. It shut down the world economy. It locked down the world economy. And what's going to happen? It's going to come right back, okay? It's expected to come back to its former level in mid-2022. No reductions in fossil fuel burning at all, okay? A big fat zero, and the human race needs to come to terms with reality. What about regenerative agriculture? We see all these nice programs about getting rid of nitrogen fertilizers and having new kind of agricultural practices. Great ideas. Nitrous oxide is a terrible greenhouse gas, 300 times more potent than CO2. Comes from fertilizer, nitrous oxide. Here's the graph. Do you see any dips, any changes, bending the curve, something? Pardon my tie. I mean, it's not doing that. Okay, there are no permanent reductions at all. It's a big fat zero, and the human race needs to face reality. Well, I thought we were going to cut back on beef and dairy because we know that cows generate a lot of methane. Well, that's milk production from 2014 to 2020. Do you see it declining? Do you see the curve bending? We're supposed to get a 50% reduction by such and such a year. What do you see? No reductions at all. Zero. The human race needs to face reality. China. In 2020, China brought more than 3 times the number of coal-fired power plants into operation than anywhere else in the world. China continues to build coal-fired power plants at a rate that outpaces the rest of the world combined. Okay. So that's coal. We think, oh, we heard about that coal plant shutting and coal miners out of work, and we're making progress in stopping coal. Are we really? Look at that graph. That's through 2025. Do you see any dips or declines even with coal? I'm sorry. Big fat zero again. Human race needs to face reality. We're not making any progress.
I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day.
So let's panic together intelligently. Number 1, conventional solutions don't work. Number 2, demonstration projects just distract us. Number 3, promises and pledges and accords don't produce any results. And it is time that we should consider radical options. So when we start to face reality, that is what we're supposed to do, what we thought we were supposed to do, to cut everything 50% by 2030. That is what I said in my book 2 years ago. It's wrong. We need a 50% reduction by 2024, and we need 100% reduction by 2030. So let's take another look at some more of the insanity before we start getting radical. We think of climate change deniers as people who are uneducated. There are climate change deniers who are very educated, and they're businessmen, and they're investors, and they watch CNBC, and they play the markets, and they read the Wall Street Journal. Capitalism is a major culprit in this entire equation, okay? China is a capitalist country. China will export 12 new coal-fired plants into Africa before 2030. It will equal in output the entire coal power capacity of the European Union within the next few years. Okay? China is virtually alone in backing Africa's dirty coal projects. They're at it. No stopping. Steel production will increase by 25% by 2030. Wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to cut 10%, 20%, 50%, 100%. You're going to increase steel production 25%. There it is, that graph. You see it? That's a projection to increase steel production 25% in the next critical 8.5 years. Steel adds 3.2 million tons of CO2 annually to global emissions. This is Jim Cramer on CNBC, and he says, buy this stock, Nucor. It is, and he makes that recommendation in 2019. Buy Nucor. You'll make money investing in a company that is going to join the industry in throwing 3.2 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere and increase production by 25% in the next 8.5 years. Make some money. The American trucking industry foresees a 25% increase in trucking demand by 2030. Those 16-wheelers. Even though the average SUV gets only 22 miles per gallon, sales will double by 2030. GM, where are you? Fracking will increase 3% every year until 2030. I thought we were supposed to cut methane. 3% more every year? Oil production will increase by 30% by 2030. What about, it's like a voice in the wilderness. Plastics production will increase 50% by 2030. Now, collective insanity is this. Part of your personality is doing this, Dr. Jekyll. The other part is doing that, Mr. Hyde. It's one side is sabotaging the other. Trader Joe's is eliminating plastic bags, and we are too. But the plastics industry is going to increase plastics production 50%. That's what insanity means, when one part of you is sabotaging the other part. More oil, more gas, more fracking, more steel, more coal, more trucking, more beef, more SUVs, more cheese, more dairy. Nobody is listening. The average salary among financial workers in Wall Street is almost $400,000 a year. This party is not going to end anytime soon. And guess what? This party has to be stopped. Okay? It has to go to rehab. Invest in oil and gas and coal? Really? This guy 4 weeks ago says oil stocks are the golden triangle of awesomeness. Now is the time to invest in oil and gas for profit. That's a few months ago. Warren Buffett bets big on oil. I thought he was our friend. Buy coal stocks 1 month ago. Coal stocks are on fire, no kidding. Well, Wall Street is living in an asylum. Okay? It is not in touch with reality. And it is a huge, huge driver. So if we translate what it means to make more money in oil, gas, and coal stocks, it means you're going to take money and invest it to make profits so that you can destroy the environment, destroy your children's future, destroy their children's future so that you can have more cash in your pocket today. That's what that means. Okay? I hope you'll have some place to spend it. Here's Greta's message to all the Jim Cramers of the world.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you.
Jane Fonda says, I beg people to ratchet up their action on climate change. This is it, folks. This is the time. And Greta sets off a worldwide mass movement. 6 million people participated in 185 different countries. She appeared in Canada to the largest political demonstration in the history of Canada. Okay, she ignited something.
We are unstoppable. A better health is possible. We are unstoppable. A better health is possible.
So scientists have signed a document endorsing mass civil disobedience. I don't think in my entire career, I'm a Vietnam War person of that era. I don't ever remember scientists recommending that you break the law in such large numbers. Things are dire. Radical solutions are necessary. This is a professor of sustainability leadership. Climate change is now a planetary emergency posing an existential threat to humanity. There will be near-term collapse in society with serious ramifications. Catastrophe is probable and extinction is possible. Bill McGibbon, if we don't act quickly and on a global scale, then the problem will literally become insoluble. Angela Merkel got all dressed up on New Year's Eve and people thought she's going to say Happy New Year. She addressed the nation and she said, climate change is real and dangerous. 11,000 scientists worldwide said we face a catastrophic threat to humanity. And just a week ago, that number goes up to 14,000 scientists. So isn't it time for more radical remedies? Well, part 2, here are 10 radical remedies. Let's get right into it. The first one is a presidential declaration of a national emergency and invocation of presidential emergency powers, okay? There were 3 people who were running for president. Those 3. They didn't get very far, but they all said that if they were elected the first day in office, they would declare a national emergency on climate change. Okay, the powers. I've contacted strangely enough, the climate change movement has not explored this very much, but some lawyers who are constitutional lawyers have, and the powers are actually quite formidable. The president can, once he declares that, he has the power to resist lobbyist pressures, the trucking lobby, the cheese lobby, the fracking lobby, the auto lobby, the oil lobby. Okay, he can resist those things. He's a little bit insulated from it. He has the power to build solar and wind infrastructure much more easily. Now, you don't have to get permits from cities and states and counties. He also has the power to ration, he or she also has the power to ration supplies. Roosevelt rationed sugar and gasoline in World War II. And the most powerful tool that he has is sanctions, trade, international trade. How do we stop China from burning so much coal? We can't go to war with China. It's a nuclear power. How do we stop it? Here's how presidential emergency powers can work. Here comes Barbie doll. Watch this. Barbie is made in China. You see those smokestacks? There are 6 coal-fired power plants in that particular city in China. And they manufacture a lot of things, one of which is they manufacture Barbie. Barbie is made there. She gets on a diesel truck. China has 10 million diesel trucks that burn a form of diesel fuel that throws black soot up into the atmosphere far more than Western diesel fuel. She gets on a boat and off she goes to pollute the atmosphere more until she arrives at Oakland or Long Beach, where she's offloaded and taken right to Walmart or Target or wherever else she's going to go. One Barbie is sold, I think, every 8 seconds in this world. Now the president can say, we're putting embargoes and tariffs on any country that manufactures products that they are selling to us that come from coal-fired power plants. He can give China 2 or 3 years to retool, but to say there we will purchase no goods that are made by cities and factories where coal is the energy supplier. Okay? Now, the United States has sanctions on 29 countries in the world. It has nothing to do with climate change. It has a lot to do with hegemony and the military-industrial complex, but nothing to do with climate change. But it could. So if China says, oh, we don't care, we'll sell Barbie to Mexico, you can't stop us. We don't need to change our infrastructure and get rid of our coal-fired power plants. Well, the United States is the largest economy in the world. It can also say, we sanction third parties that do business with China. If Mexico decides to purchase Barbies from China, we can say we're not going to trade with Mexico either. Do you remember there was a French bank that did business with Iran? What business is it of ours that a French bank is doing business with Iran? We sanctioned it, we fined it, and they had to pay a fine to us. So the president does have incredible powers here. He also has the power to build out massive infrastructure. Do you remember Trump ordered General Motors to make ventilators? Well, he could also order cities and counties to suspend their permitting regulations so that wind generation and solar farms can be built. Here are two leaders in the climate change movement who talk about how we need to mobilize like we mobilized in World War II.
The economic historians remind us that even though we give FDR and the New Deal the credit for ending the Great Depression, what really ended it was World War II, when we mobilized for a great national effort in which the survival of our country and our values was deemed to be at stake. And when we decided to act, then we put people to work and the economy started booming like never before. Well, this time the threat is different, and it doesn't trigger the ancient reflexes we inherited from our ancestors when they were attacked by other humans with weapons, but it is nonetheless a threat to our survival. This stuff is no joke.
That come after us are looking up, and we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it? And like, this is the war. This is our World War II.
So the man who came up with that analogy really is Lester Brown, a really, really wonderful environmentalist. Wrote quite a number of very powerful books. And he said, you know, in the United States in World War II, we stopped manufacturing cars. We made 50,000 tanks and 256,000 airplanes in the space of like 3 years. So wartime mobilization is called for, is necessary, and it can accomplish a great deal. So the president could begin a massive development of solar and wind farms. Burning fossil fuel constitutes 92% of all greenhouse gases, and solar farms are less expensive in their lifetime than building coal-fired power plants. Okay? So what we need is 21,000 square miles to power the U.S. The world needs 191,000 square miles of solar farms. Okay. In my other book, or in my prior presentation, it said, well, the good news is that if we're going to get a 50% cut, we only need 95,000 square miles to get a 50% reduction globally. Half the size of Spain by 2030. Well, this has to be revised because of this new information. Half the size of Spain, not by 2030, but by 2024. 3 years. It's got to start now. That's where it begins in the United States, called the blue square. In Europe, the middle square would power the entire European Union. But wind power also can supplement solar power. Wind turbines are cheaper than coal, gas, and nuclear, and they are 70% more efficient if they're offshore. Not every country can do that, Not every country has the wind, but many countries do. So you'd need about 4 million wind turbines to power the world, 2 million to get a 0.5%, a 50% reduction, and less than that if you're complementing that with solar. Now, there are other conventional remedies that actually work. Carbon taxes work, but people don't like them. In Australia and France, they protested. Conservation really works, but it's one thing to ask an American to go to Starbucks and please use a metal straw instead of a plastic straw. But more than half of people in the world earn less than $5 a day. So it's very difficult for them to voluntarily conserve, which leads to a radical remedy called rationing. Few environmentalists talk about it, but some do. It's a form of forced conservation, which actually is very equitable. The climate crisis is like a world war, so let's talk about rationing, says one op-ed writer. Well, that's what we're going to do. There are 3 things that can be rationed: beef, electricity, transportation. So watch this. Cows produce 14% of global emissions, okay?
And after this, we collect inside the bag.
So how long has that bag been collecting gas?
Only 2 hours.
Methane is something like 22 times more potent as a climate-changing gas than is CO2. So it doesn't take very much methane to make a difference.
A cow can basically fill up a 55-gallon garbage bag full of methane every day. One cow's not a problem, but now we have 1.5 billion of them. And it's an incredibly inefficient way of producing food. 3/4 of agricultural land is used just to feed livestock. When you factor in everything, the clearing of the land for grazing, feeding, transporting, livestock causes more greenhouse gases than all the direct emissions from the entire transportation sector.
So, the major beef eaters in the world are the US, Canada, Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand. Average American eats 800 hamburgers per year. The US is 4th in the world in per capita beef consumption. China's only 47, Japan 28. Okay, now, what if you did 50% rationing of beef? Okay, instead of, some people say, well, raise the price of beef. Sure, the rich have to pay more, the poor don't even get beef. By rationing, everybody gets the same amount. It's a very equitable way of dealing with this problem. An American at 50% rationing would still have enough for 1 hamburger a day. Okay? Cutting beef consumption by half would produce a 7% reduction in global emissions. That's amazing. Rationing electricity. Electricity is 25% of global emissions. Cut it in half, you save 12.5% of that 50% target. Okay? Now here is the average American home is now 1,000 square feet larger than it was in 1973. We have the same size family. Our families didn't get bigger, our houses got bigger. Okay? So if you ration electricity to the median, the average American household uses 911 kilowatts per month. If you said, okay, that's the ceiling, not the middle. That's the ceiling. No one can use more than that. Well, a house on your left is a typical American house, all right? And they wouldn't have any problems, nor would the poor. That's how much electricity they use anyway. The house on the right has, 3 flat screen televisions, 4 air conditioners, 1 hot tub pump, 1 pool pump. If they're going to go dark after 911 kilowatt hours, they're going to have to shut off a few air conditioners and televisions to make it through to the end of the month. Transportation is a tough one. Okay, those cars, the white lights, that's the Los Angeles freeway on Thanksgiving. The white lights are coming toward you. The red lights are going away from you. Americans burn 391 million gallons of gasoline every single day. All right. How do you cut that in half? That's a tough one. So, cars and trucks account for 20% of all U.S. emissions. The average car in the United States gets 24 miles a gallon. So, if you want to cut things in half, you have to double that to 50 miles a gallon, right? The average truck gets 13 to 19 miles per gallon, and the average 16-wheeler gets 6 miles per gallon. We have to make the changes, okay? Globally, we burn 100 million barrels of oil every day. We have 1 billion cars on the road, and we're making 83 million new ones every year. Transportation is 14% of all emissions globally. So, if you look at our old graph, you see the old graph that we put in the earlier about fossil fuels, you can see that they went down 15% in 1 year. That was because of COVID. Okay, rationing, like in World War II, we would have to pull that down 15% every year until we got to a 50% level. Okay, not come back up, but keep going, which means driving less, not traveling very much, cutting back. So the ration would be this. The average American uses 54 gallons of gasoline per month, and gradually we'd come down year after year after year to a maximum of 27 gallons per month, which means you're going to say, well, we're going to have to get a different car. And the government needs to give incentives to remove existing cars. The average age is 12 years. We need to move into more efficient cars. There are 13-mile models now that get 50 miles a gallon. By 2025, they expect to have 120 models. The government needs to facilitate people getting rid of their old cars, not selling them, destroying them, and building up a whole new fleet of cars. So, ration gasoline and diesel by 15% each year. No cars manufactured, imported, or exported unless they get 50 miles a gallon within 3 years. Presidential directive. Removal of existing cars globally with global incentives given. Big, big job. Switch 25% of trucking to rail. Those are proposals that are out there in the literature. So here are some models that give way over 50 miles a gallon. Hybrids, EVs. But there's no denying this is a very massive undertaking, and it is extremely costly. We'll get to cost later. Okay? Airlines constitute 3% of global emissions, so we have to do something about that. It's an interesting discovery. 70% of all flights taken are taken by the wealthiest 15% of the population. Interesting, isn't it? The average American flies 3,000 miles a year. Well, we're going to make that not average. That's the ceiling. If we're going to cut it in half. So the average American would be having a ration card, kind of like frequent flyer miles in reverse. So they would have a card that allows them to fly 3,000 miles a year. Maybe they would trade with relatives so they could make their European trip. So these are draconian measures. How are we doing? Well, with wind and solar, we could cut 45%. With rationing of beef, electricity, and transportation, we could get to a total of 71% reductions. It is all still possible, but it requires a World War II mentality. There's hope. There are lots of technologies that are interesting, exciting, possibles. One may come through and rescue us, but for now, they're just hypothetical. Now, there are other kinds of emissions that we need to look at, that we need to cut future emissions, things that have to be stopped. One is called deforestation, all right? In 2018, the human race wiped out an area of forest the size of Belgium, okay? Since 1990, you're not going to believe this, humanity has wiped out forests equivalent in size to Australia. We have to stop that. Population growth. We are adding 73 million new people every year. That's one Iran every year. Okay, as one environmentalist said, more feet, more heat. So the best way to do that is to start a global contraception initiative with what is called the contraceptive implant. It is popular, it is inexpensive, and it works. A third issue is wildfires. When they ignite, they send CO2 into the atmosphere. We need to stop the wildfires. They're raging as I speak. There are 5 times more wildfires in 2019 than in 2018, and twice as many acres were burned in 2020 than in 2019. We have to put the fires out. Now, here comes the most radical recommendation in my pantheon of recommendations: the UN occupation of the Amazon basin. The Amazon rainforest is about to cross an irreversible threshold that will turn it into a savanna, top scientists say. One Harvard professor just rather modestly said, "It's only a matter of time until major powers try to stop climate change by any means necessary." Whoa, getting dangerous.
Way to clear land. And in August 2019, over 30,000 fires were burning in the Amazon, 3 times as many as August 2018. Many set illegally by ranchers, farmers, and landowners, emboldened by the government's new stance on the Amazon. But this time, the Amazon is unlikely to survive another wave of deforestation. In the last 50 years, it's estimated that about 17% of the Amazon has been deforested.
So if you look at the wildfires in the Amazon basin in 2019, they peaked at 80,000 fires in 1 year. Now the UN has peacekeeping operations in all those countries you see, but this is more than a peacekeeping operation. This is pretty much of a war. Well, let's not go to war. Let's have sanctions and have embargoes and try to avoid war. France threatened to have economic retaliation against Brazil unless they put out the fires. Ireland said they're going to block a trade deal with Brazil if it kept the fires raging. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson in England said it's an international crisis. Angela Merkel said those fires are an acute emergency for the whole world. Well, what was the result of all that? In 2020, Brazilian wildfires surged again. In 2021, the Brazilian Amazon is burning again. Okay? This is a recognition that threats, embargoes, sanctions, condemnation simply do not work. I'm not very good at coming up for reasons for war, but some scientists say the Amazon basin is the lungs of the earth. It manufactures 20% of the oxygen we breathe. Somebody is burning down our oxygen supply, and that has to stop. So it means that will probably be a hot war. We've had hot wars in Pakistan, Iraq, okay? We're killing people all over the place, but not for the purposes of saving the planet. Well, this would have the effect of causing a major recession in Brazil and reduce their economy by about 10%. Another proposal is the UN occupation of selected provinces of Malaysia and Indonesia, where they make palm oil. When they burn down forests in that area of the world in order to plant palm oil plantations, those fires spew incredible amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. In 1 year, those fires put in as much CO2 into the atmosphere as Japan, in another as much as the United States, in another year as much as Canada. Okay? This is a short video.
There's a good chance you're not familiar with it, even though you'll find it in many of the products you use every day. It's in everything, from makeup and toothpaste to donuts, chocolate bars, and in some countries, biodiesel fuel. It goes by many names, but it's most commonly known as palm oil. Global consumption of palm oil has quintupled since 1990. Oil derived from the palm fruit is easy to extract, has a higher yield than other types of vegetable oils, and can be used in dozens of products. But the proliferation of palm oil also poses a massive environmental threat. Each year, palm oil plantations destroy millions of acres of forested land, create billions of tons of carbon pollution, and kill endangered wildlife. All of this makes the palm oil industry one of the worst environmental offenders on the planet. In 2015, over 62,000 square miles around the world, much of it former forests, were committed to palm oil plantations. That's an area 4 times the size of Switzerland. Palm oil is one of the top 3 drivers of deforestation in Indonesia, a country that supplies more than half of global demand. Each year in Indonesia, fires are set to clear forested lands to make way for palm oil production. Just last year, over 10,000 square miles were torched, creating fires so big they could be seen from outer space. All of this unleashes massive amounts of carbon into the air. Fires in 2015 added more than 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
So here's the idea. UN occupation and creation of protectorates and a worldwide ban on palm oil. If possible, a worldwide ban on palm oil might stop the deforestation, but it doesn't help us with reforestation. So the idea is a cessation of all commercial activity in the Amazon, no soybeans, no cattle ranching, no mining, and depopulating the area. In Indonesia and Malaysia, no palm oil, which may allow us to avoid a hot war. We're not sure of that. So once that happens, reforestation is to begin immediately. 120,000 square miles of the Amazon need to be reforested. 72,000 square miles of Indonesia and Malaysia need to be reforested, and 200,000 square miles in North America. It takes 10 years for a tree to get big enough and powerful enough to start doing its job, which is to remove CO2 in some kind of measurable amount. So we need to start this now. Another radical remedy, okay, here's another one. These are not mine necessarily, they're gleaned from the literature. Wildfire response teams and 100 supertankers. Okay, there were 72,000 fires in Malaysia and Indonesia in 2018, 80,000 in the Amazon, 2 million acres burned in the Amazon. Millions of acres burned in Siberia. Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, said, we can't reach them. They're thousands of miles away. Tankers can fly a couple hundred miles. There are only 2 tankers that can reach these fires, super tankers, the 747 and the Aleutian 76. They can fly 2,000 miles there and 2,000 miles back. They can reach those fires, but we only have 13 of them in the United States. 13. Bolivia rented 1 supertanker last year to fight its fires. Okay, what we need is a UN 100 supertanker force with 18 staging areas throughout various regions of the world: northern Canada, northern Siberia, Africa, Australia, Indonesia. Okay, where these planes, which can carry 20,000 gallons of fire retardant and water, can reach and put out these fires. In Australia last year, there were such huge fires that an area the size of South Korea burned down. And there was a petition going around in Australia, maybe we should use a 747 to get to these fires. That's the idea, but not one. We need to have a tanker force that can reach these quickly and put them out. Another recommendation is to ban all fracking. After all, we actually stopped methane for about 10 years. In 2000, methane going into the atmosphere flattened out until the United States came up with the idea of fracking. We increased methane production into the atmosphere, and 80% of the increase in methane comes from the United States fracking industry.
I don't have to explain to anyone here that the growing body of evidence tells us that fracking is a danger to the air we breathe and can cause lung cancer. It has resulted in more earthquakes, it is highly explosive, and it is contributing to climate change.
So here are the 10 radical remedies. All right, summary. Declaration of presidential emergency powers to begin immediately. Occupation of the Amazon basin and Indonesian provinces to begin immediately. reforestation of the Amazon and Indonesian provinces and Malaysian provinces and North America to begin immediately. The United Nations Wildfire Air Tanker Force to begin immediately. Worldwide ban on fracking to begin immediately. Construction of 91,000 square miles of solar farms and or wind farm equivalents to begin immediately. Embargo all Chinese imports made from coal-fired power plants to begin in 3 years. Let's give them a little time to retool and avoid nuclear war. But to make a very definitive statement that this has got to stop. No more coal burning. Elimination of all vehicles getting under 50 miles per gallon. Again, over 3 years, it's going to take some time. Rationing beef, electricity, and gasoline to begin immediately. Global contraception initiative to begin immediately. And for one more for good measure, to begin a phased delisting of all stocks on the global exchanges which profit from fossil fuel burning to begin over the next 3 years. Maybe we'll give them till the next 5 years. Okay. So those are the reasons. If we begin this now, we have a slim chance to stay under 1.5 degrees. And I emphasize the word slim. If we get to net zero by 2030, which seems almost impossible, but not with it. If we follow these recommendations, we'll get there. We can have a slim chance of staying under 2 degrees. And if we can't, and this is all seen as way too radical, way too expensive, the point of no return cannot be prevented. So what's it cost? Joe Biden said he's going to have a plan that costs $1.7 trillion. Elizabeth Warren, $3 trillion. But they're only talking about the United States. They're not talking about the world. We need to talk about the world. The Green New Deal was up to $36 trillion. Makes a little more sense. So the outline in the book for how much it's actually going to cost is about $28 trillion. And that is shared by all the nations of the world proportionately, and it is also amortized over quite a number of years, so it becomes possible. So you could ask, okay, now we know that it's possible. What can I do personally? Well, the most important thing that you can do is to support activism, radical activism. Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion. Okay, those are the first two. But flush 3 times less per day, stop burning wood in your fireplace, recycle paper and aluminum, stop buying water in plastic water bottles. That plastic goes to a landfill 90% of the time and stays there for 450 years. Stop all beef and dairy, reduce electricity by 50% over time, use LEDs, and contribute to the International Planned Parenthood Fund. And if you have the money, put solar panels on your home, charge your EV from the sun, and install a Tesla Powerwall battery. You will really reduce your carbon footprint that way. What else can you do? Buy Ecocide and give it to your friends. Download this video before it is censored by YouTube and spread the word. This is an emergency. But I would like to let Greta have the last word. Here she is in 2020, speaking at the Davos Economic Forum.
But the fact that we are all about to fail the commitments you signed up for in the Paris Agreement doesn't seem to bother the people in power even the least. Any plan or policy of yours that doesn't include radical emission cuts at the source starting today is completely insufficient for meeting the 1.5 or well below 2 degree commitments of the Paris Agreement. You say children shouldn't worry. You say, just leave this to us. We will fix this. We promise we won't let you down. Don't be so pessimistic. And then, nothing. Silence. Or something worse than silence. Empty words and promises which give the impression that sufficient action is being taken. We demand at this year's World Economic Forum participants from all companies, banks, institutions and governments immediately halt all investments in fossil fuel exploration and extraction, immediately end all fossil fuel subsidies, and immediately and completely divest from fossil fuels. We don't want these things done by 2050, 2030, or even 2021. We want this done now. It may seem like we are asking for a lot, and you will, of course, say that we are naive. But this is just the very minimum amount of effort that is needed to start the rapid sustainable transition. I wonder, what will you tell your children was the reason to fail and leave them facing a climate chaos that you knowingly brought upon them? That it seemed so bad for the economy that we decided to resign the idea of securing future living conditions without even trying? Our house is still on fire. Your inaction is fueling the flames by the hour. And we are telling you to act as if you loved your children above all else.